My beef with the baby boomers should go well with the usual Thanksgiving theme of relatives. This is MultimediaJay radio style for Black Friday, November 29th, 2019. Let's start the show.
MultimediaJay radio style.
So it's Black Friday, and as the holiday humbug season kicks off, we're coming off of Thanksgiving as we head towards 2020. This year in particular, I heard about a generation gap when it comes to Thanksgiving with the whole Thanksgiving versus Friendsgiving thing. We could talk about that some other time, but I actually agree with the idea of Friendsgiving, where you just get together with friends instead of family. Maybe you have a situation where you're away from most of your family, so you can't get over to go see him on Thanksgiving. So there's the practical side to all of that. But in today's day and age, I think Friendsgiving is a natural response to where families have gone over the past several decades. And just what does it mean to even be a family in the first place? Or is it a chore to have to put up with those relatives you only see during the holidays? I mean, how much longer can you kid yourself by, I gotta get together with those relatives I can't stand, or those in-laws I can't stand. I gotta get together with all these people that I wouldn't have anything to do with for any other reason, any other time of the year, just because it's the holidays. Yeah, I can see where Friendsgiving came from. And since we're talking about issues with relatives and whatnot and disagreements with folks in your family, I suppose now's as good a time as ever to talk about my beef with the baby boomers. There's so much that I can say about this, so we're just going to try and keep it to a general overview. But as an older millennial, this whole thing with baby boomers versus millennials is something that I only very recently found out about. And unfortunately, when I found out about it, it also hit very close to home with my relationship with my own father as well. Up until very recently, I would say nice things about how things panned out between myself and my dad, and so would other people as well. They were like, wow, you actually had a constructive relationship with your father. I wish my dad was like that. So this is something that both of us should be proud of. Instead, and most unfortunately, when he retired, my dad basically jumped on soapbox after soapbox after soapbox about, young people don't do this right. Young people don't do that right. In my day, we did this instead of that. Young people don't do this right. Oh my goodness. Really? We're gonna go there. See, the thing is, at that very same time, he probably had no idea just how much of a nerve that strikes with millennials because of the current dispute going around on the internet between boomers and millennials, and eventually leading to the OK Boomer thing, which actually is from Gen Z, the folks in their 20s right now, as opposed to us millennials in our 30s. So but that's a totally different discussion altogether. But I get where the Gen Zs are coming from, because at the same time my dad started jumping on the soapboxes he's jumped on, he's fortunately been a more mild example of this generation gap. He's at least somewhat seemed to be understanding about how it's a different world. Young people struggle in very different ways than he did when he was that age. But some of the people I see on social media, man, it is outrageous. Let me tell you something. Baby boomers on social media give social media a bad name. Oh, man. You want to talk about young people can't save money? I wish I had a nickel for every single time I've seen a baby boomer on social media send spammy stuff around or spread misinformation or in some way, shape, or form realize that the whole posting things on social media thing reflects on you thing. Have that actually click for a change instead of, look, some boomer who knows my dad is friending me because, I'm his son. Let's see what his son is like. And then I end up with some boomer that's like some kind of replacement grandparent. Oh, boy. Look, boomers, I don't need replacement grandparents. Let's shut that down right now. You are insulting my real late grandparents and their memory by trying to in any way fill in their shoes. And then there's the spam. I'm old now, so that automatically means I have to be conservative, so I'm going to send all this Trump stuff around. Yeah, I'm a business school grad who's very cynical of personal marketers like Trump. People like Donald Trump at the negotiating table are usually my enemy because I'm the cynical person looking to pick apart the sales presentation. Let's just say if you're trying to sell my company something and I'm at the negotiating table, and let's say you were a puppet person or something, you're putting on a puppet show, I'd be the guy looking to see where the strings were going. That's my very cynical, skeptical role whenever someone's coming after me with a sales presentation. Trump does a lot of personal sales type stuff with his brand. So I am very cynical and skeptical of anything he gets all braggadocious about. So needless to say, little old ladies trying to be all political on Facebook, sending me all that Trump stuff is just annoying me more than anything else. And that assumes we're talking about political stuff, which you're not supposed to talk about at the Thanksgiving dinner table. Let's swing the conversation over to the other thing you're not supposed to talk about, religion. I get a good laugh out of all of these little old ladies sending me these spam chain letter things on social media. You're not a real Christian and you're ashamed of Jesus if you don't send this to at least 10 other people. Please spare me. You know, I disagree with the idea that you should always make fun of old people. I mean, it's not fun to live life knowing there's a point of no return where after you have a few too many birthdays, nobody takes you seriously anymore. I don't agree with this idea at all. But you keep seeing over and over again people wanting to play into this stuff. Come on now. So as you can imagine, this boomer versus millennial thing is the sort of thing I could talk about for a very long period of time. So what we're going to do is we're going to try and keep this to a general overview, and we probably won't go into as much detail as we should, but we'll try and get that hammered out at some point later on. But when it comes to my beef with the baby boomers, this is the sort of thing my dad's been scratching his head about. He's like, well, what's all the stuff on the internet and why do you agree with it? Are you just going along with something you saw on the internet yet again? Not really. There really is a disconnect between the expectations for younger people and what the boomers were handed. Now, this is the part where some millennial pundit or whatever says that the boomers are completely out of touch. They don't realize how good they had it with the various stuff that just lined up for them with Americana and the stuff that folks call the good old days. But as someone who actually does some digging and follows the history a bit, I will actually go further than some of these talking heads when it comes to boomer versus millennial and actually acknowledge that some of the good stuff that some boomers out there have unjustly used as a standard to which young people don't measure up. Some of the good stuff they received was an anomaly. It was pure luck because of the conditions of the world at the time. For example, a strong manufacturing sector with high-wage jobs and an easy access to the middle class and easy ways to build yourself up into something in the post-war period. The Americana, the good old days, as some people would call it, where you grew up in a stable two-parent family in suburbia or whatever, the Charlie Brown childhoods that myself, my generation, and so many other folks seem to have established as some kind of standard. There's a certain way that you should live in America. You should have a nice, stable childhood in a house with both parents and brothers and sisters in a nice neighborhood going to a nice school. Then you go to college, you graduate with a nice degree, and then you have a nice, stable career for decades, and then you have a nice retirement, aka actual stability in life. Is that what we have? Not even close. And so anybody who's able to check most or all of the stuff off of that list has had it very well and needs to check their privilege when criticizing others who aren't doing so well. And there's another wild card to that as well. When you hear, for example, the boomer versus millennial thing on the internet, and you hear talks about young people can't save money, young people live beyond their means, young people don't pull themselves up by their bootstraps, and then there's a comparison of things like college costs and all kinds of other stuff, housing costs, college costs, wages, salaries, ways to build yourself up into somebody. The detail that I never hear, even from the politicians who are trying to get into public office, by promising more stability for people in their lives and bringing back the glory days of the 50s or whatever with, oh, great middle-class jobs, blah, blah, blah. The thing I never hear, even from the politicians, is that prosperity in post-war America was an anomaly. Coming out of World War II, much of the industrialized world had been leveled or severely damaged or bombed or whatever. And then, in some parts of the world, the fighting didn't stop. There was wars about what to do after the imperial powers left, whether or not to become communist, all kinds of things that damage infrastructure and industrial capacity, leading to it being a long time before anybody can challenge the United States in terms of industrial stuff. Europe, tons of bombing. Parts of Asia, tons of bombing. Japan had 2 nukes dropped on it. All kinds of places with industrial stuff was also a front in the war. So there were things to rebuild. There were governments to figure out. There was whether or not do we want to become communist or not. And then, of course, you have the Iron Curtain, communists not selling to non-communists. The market conditions alone ensured that America would have it good for decades after the war. The baby boomers just happened to be lucky enough to be born into all good stuff and none of the bad stuff that came before it. Like the silent generation that grew up during the Depression, or the World War II's GI's greatest generation, which were my grandparents, who were born in the 20s. And you figure, you start remembering stuff from your childhood around age 5. Both of my grandparents were born in the early 20s, so they probably had some childhood memories of the Roaring 20s before Black Tuesday. And then, bam, Great Depression. The entire rest of their childhood, into their adolescence, into their young adult life, wrecked by something beyond their control. I can't even imagine what that would do to somebody, to have an entire chunk of your life wrecked because of something that you couldn't control like that. Especially nowadays, in our day and age, where we put so much emphasis on youth and, oh, have fun when you're young and all this other stuff that wasn't around in my grandparents' time when they were growing up. That's the whole youth culture thing kind of started in the 50s when young people could start driving cars around and stuff. Teen culture as we know it, 50s. So the so-called good old days, according to the boomers. Oh, wait, is some of this starting to sound familiar? There's a large part of your young life that gets dinged by something really nasty economics-wise that, oh, wait a minute. This sounds like Gen Z. Oh, yes. And this is something I've been trying to explain to the Generation X managers that I work with, is that, oh, look, all these people in their 20s and whatnot that are coming to work at the 9 to 5, they seem to be socially awkward and nervous and a little shaky about taking the reins of something or taking charge of something. Yes, because they are essentially the new generation that is going to be overly tenacious because some part of their young life got damaged by an economic crisis. In this case, the Great Recession instead of the Great Depression. But I can't even imagine what it's like, and I'm not going to pretend to because I can't relate, because I'm not in that generation. I'm not going to try to pretend that I could know what I'm talking about with this, because that's not what I experienced. But I'm thinking of the Gen Zs. They grew up, and sometime in their childhood or adolescence, the Great Recession happened, if not both, and everything took a hit. Mom and dad got laid off. They couldn't find any decent jobs except part-time stocking shelves at Target or something. And so they're coming into the workforce in their 20s, and literally everybody else around them could have had a happy childhood and adolescence, and they didn't. They grew up with their smartphone or something, or maybe they had an Xbox or a PlayStation being the best thing they had going for them, because the Great Recession has defined the whole early part of their lives. Even though they might, depending on how old they are, have some memories of the pre-recession world as young children. So this is the sort of things, these are the sorts of empathy issues and whatnot that I'm thinking about when it comes to boomers versus millennials, is not realizing when a generation has it better than another and trying to learn from it and be more of a civil, understanding human being to those less fortunate. I'll keep that in mind the next time somebody calls someone my age a snowflake or something. Or, oh, you just want your participation trophy. No, there were some pretty real differences between what the generations had to deal with. And every one of them had their challenges. I'm not going to discount things like air raid drills and worrying about the Soviets nuking everybody, or stuff that the boomers had to deal with in their time as well. Plus, there were recessions in the 80s and there the gas crisis in the 70s and stuff like that. So every generation has its challenges, but the thing not to do is to stand on your soapbox about something you had better than those that came after you, and then snub the younger generation saying, I got mine, sucks to be you, or some kind of variant of that. It's also an issue when, as I mentioned earlier, some of the good stuff that your generation had, like the post-war prosperity to basically find your footing in and develop a career in as somebody growing up in the 60s and 70s, was an anomaly. Basically, America getting lucky and the results of what happened at the end of World War II, or the way things were at the end of World War II. And unless somebody has some evil plan to level most of the industrialized world again, we're not going to see that because the market conditions are just not that anymore. And it's downright dishonest to get people thinking that they can have that if that's just not the case anymore. What really matters is working towards making things better in the here and now, as opposed to chasing after some romanticized vision of years gone by. Because if you're going to say, let's have what we had in the 60s again, or the 50s again, or the 70s again, if you're going to say something like that, then you got to look at the history. What exactly did the world have in those decades? And is it really worth chasing after again? Take the 50s, for example. I've traditionally, as I've grown up, heard the 50s described as this wonderful golden decade. That was the good old days before the 60s ruined everything. Yeah, but guess what? There was also institutionalized racism and sexism in that day as well. You know, you look at some stuff from the 50s and whatnot. Oh, be a man, work in a factory. Hey, this woman wants to work in a factory, blah, blah, blah. There's all kinds of cringy stuff nowadays. And let's also not forget, in the post-war Americana period, we thought asbestos was amazing. There were ads for cigarettes on TV before we found out about the links to cancer and everything. You know, I've seen a lot of this stuff, and it's these dumb little things that poke holes in this whole idea that there's this golden decade that we should chase after. But I think the real issue here, though, is quite frankly that the United States was in a position to do really well in the world markets for manufacturing and making things for quite some time after the war. And that, plus the GI Bill for the folks that fought in World War II and things along those lines, fed into what exactly made the good old days, according to most boomers, so good. Things probably would have been a lot different if the United States hadn't been so lucky, or had actually been some kind of front in World War II, and there were bombing raids on Boston and New York or Chicago or something along those lines, much like there was across much of Europe that was rebuilding after the war. But that hasn't stopped all of this snooty stuff with the whole boomer versus millennial thing from poisoning much of social media, where you can't take 2 steps on Facebook or something without seeing somebody on like some news site or something making fun of millennials or something, even though it's a completely different world. And some of the stuff that the boomers had growing up in the 60s and 70s that gave them a leg up on things are things they should be grateful for, because it wasn't normal for them to get the kind of breaks that they got in some areas, like with, for example, the post-war prosperity, or a situation where maybe they can say, well, you don't understand. Your grandparents struggled to keep the roof over our heads too. Yeah, with 4 or 5 kids. There's people out there struggling with no kids nowadays. Keep that in mind. And since this has turned into a kind of general across the board, dabble a little here, dabble a little there kind of discussion about the various things I could talk about with regards to the whole boomer versus millennial thing, I should probably throw in one more example of something that raised my eyebrows on this whole matter, and that is the sheer number of millennials and Gen Zs that I've seen that have either bankrupted themselves or they've set themselves up to financially collapse because of chasing after what the boomers had. Oh, George W. Bush Ownership Society in the early 2000s. We should buy a house. Even though there is no such thing as career stability in the job world right now, with boomers at the head, may I add, and some Gen X folks rising into the ranks. But in this day and age, where your company will blindside lay you off because reasons, and you have absolutely no reason to believe that this company that you're working for is investing in you at all. And then, of course, the millennials get complained about for having no loyalty in the workplace and that kind of stuff. So how can you buy a house and be stuck in one place with a 30-year mortgage instead of renting all the time when you have just this kind of instability in the professional world at large? Then there's kids and the medical debt that having a kid in the United States incurs, and the costs of raising kids, completely flying in the face of all those millennial and Gen Z moms out there that I've known over the years who don't think that they're really a good mom until they've had 2 or 3 kids. You know, I don't think I want to be done having kids until I've had 2 or 3, or in the case of 5 Baby Lady, the narcissist that I was talking about earlier, 5 kids, and they'd better be her own or else. Just these distorted views on what it means to amount to something in life. All of it informed by baby boomers and stuff that was an anomaly that should not be considered normal for the conditions to have a family in our day and age. And then there's college. Millennials are infamous for student debt. I have issues with student debt, but not to the extent of a lot of the other folks that I hear that are landing in the news because of how much debt they have to pay off, because of how they got bamboozled because of the whole college thing. Go to college, graduate in a higher earning bracket. The student loans won't be so annoying because you'll be making more money. As I sarcastically roasted in that cartoon I did in Plotagon way back when, no sooner did I graduate with a computer information systems business degree than the geniuses in charge of all these companies out there sent the IT jobs to India. And I've watched since then as whatever IT actually stays in America is treated more and more like disposable dirt, contractor plus, not a real member of the team, to the point where I've been persistently disappointed in every single IT interview that I've gone for, and I question whether it's even a viable field anymore, as opposed to being an operations guy or some kind of manager who happens to have computer skills. But the good news is, now in 2019, finally, after all these years, I have a 4-digit remaining principal on the student loans into the last $10,000 of paying these dumb things off. And I'm still on the George W. Bush plan from way back in the day. I haven't even touched any of the income-based repayment options that I have available that became a thing during the Obama administration. Side note, thanks, Obama. I could switch over to the income-based thing, but I got to figure out if there's a forgiveness clause after X amount of years of paying these things back, and whether or not I'd be trading off higher payments now for a huge tax bill, because forgiven debt is tax liability with the IRS here in the United States. That's the hidden surprise in anything you might hear. Well, you just pay for 20 years, and then we'll just forgive the rest. Yeah. Hey, by the way, as my dad and I have kind of talked about this whole boomer versus millennial thing and tried to come to some kind of an agreement with each other on some things, I mentioned the monthly bill with the student loans. And he was like, "You're still paying those things off?" Surprise! Must be really embarrassing, isn't it? To find out exactly what kind of numbers I'm dealing with versus the numbers he was dealing with, especially when we factor in inflation. Welcome to our world, boomers. It's a different world, but if you're willing to learn why it's a struggle to do the same things you did, perhaps we can come to some kind of agreement and not have this be the final generation gap between us. I know throughout history, old people and young people have been going at each other, but is there any chance of any kind of understanding from either side of all of this, with the hard data like this being what it is? Plus, as I mentioned earlier, my dad's one of the more mellow examples of the OK Boomer stuff. He's done a good job of trying to be understanding of the way the world has changed and what younger people are dealing with versus what he dealt with, especially after he found out about the student loan thing with me and what I was paying every month on those things after a couple of his soapboxes about, oh, young people aren't saving money properly. And that's the thing. It's all about dialogue and understanding and knowing what the differences are instead of knee-jerk us versus them imperative crap. Like, just try harder, work harder. Yeah, in an environment which has been designed so that hard work often doesn't pay off more so than whatever your client is looking for. Oh, I'm sorry. Did I say client? I meant your employer, because there's barely any difference left between being a real member of someone's team and either a consultant or a contractor or something, because of how labor relations have deteriorated over the heyday of the boomers. But yeah, as you can tell, there is so much I can say about this, but I'm going to just take it easy and have this be just a general kind of little of this, little of that introduction to this whole generation gap discussion. I'm not happy that this could end up being the final generation gap between myself and folks my dad's age, but unfortunately, it is what it is. Just gotta figure out what to do about it. Also, like I said, my dad's a mild example of the okay boomer thing. I've actually had substantially harsher examples of this, from the way people treat each other on social media, as well as some professional contacts, or should I say, former professional contacts in that generation that I have, that just soapboxed all that crap to me, and I didn't listen because I know better. I've already got the part 2 of the story. Little did they know when they were jumping on their narcissistic soapbox. It'll suffice to say that when somebody who's been a manager, a boomer manager, I should say, consistently with a solid boomer career since the late 1980s, who works in a corporate corner office, tells me you shouldn't have a day job. You should be a wild and crazy entrepreneur doing all these things and trying all this stuff and not knowing where your next rent payment is coming from. No, I take that with a grain of salt too. By the way, my family already had the experiment of wild and crazy entrepreneur versus punching a time clock. So we know there are downsides to being your own boss and not working for someone else. But that's a completely different discussion. This general introduction has been all over the map and it's pushing the half-hour mark, so if this is interesting to any of you folks out there, feel free to leave a comment, and if you need to, blow off steam if you've encountered similar frustrations with this whole thing where folks in that age group just don't seem to get what kind of good things were handed to them and how they did have it in various ways better than most of the folks that came after them. At least before they turned around and started yardsticking everyone that came after them, and to see, oh, look, they don't measure up. Something must be wrong with them. Yeah, I don't agree with any of that stuff at all. Thanks for listening, everybody. Till next time, this is MultimediaJay signing off. Thanks for stopping by.